The Ultra Beast would be a pretty terrifying part of Scarlet and Violet. With Terastal, a lot of the biggest weaknesses these Pokemon had, such as a terrible defensive typing or the lack of one single perfect coverage move, is going to easily fix almost all these Pokemon in a competitive setting. When you can build entire EV spreads around these Pokemon in order to gain the perfect stat boost for your team, it's pretty hard to deny that these Pokemon would have some form of impact in Scarlet and Violet. So let's take a stab at predicting just how powerful the Ultra Beast could be if they were introduced in the format. Let me know what you guys think down below of my predictions, and while you're on your way down there, consider subscribing today and becoming a channel member for some extra bonus content. With that said though, let's start off with UB01 being Nihilego, which is one of the more consistent Ultra Beasts of all time in VGC, and I think it would be a pretty important Pokemon to check a couple key things in the format. With Nihilego, you could utilize this as one of the best Flutter Mane checks in the entire game, really only being outclassed by Heatran. But Nihilego has a couple things over this otherwise behemoth of a fire type. For starters, Nihilego has its own built-in speed control in the form of Trick Room, which has typically been how you've actually ran Nihilego in the past. Not only this, but with Meteor Beam, it could essentially function as the non-restricted equivalent of Lunala, but it has a much better defensive typing in the sense that you don't worry about one of the best Pokemon of all time right now. Now, I think that Nihilego would definitely find some use in the format, but it does have a few really high hurdles to overcome, such as Urshifu being one of the best options, and the fact that if Nihilego really did rise that much in relevance, Flutter Mane could honestly just throw on Psyshock just for the matchup, because Nihilego has a pretty unimpressive Phys-Def stat. Nihilego is probably one of the more average Ultra Beasts though, but I do think it is a good starting point because this kind of shows like where the middle of the pool is in my opinion, and it made more sense to just start with the first UB rather than continuing with just the worst of the best. Going to the Ultra Beast number 2 duo, let's break down Pheromosa and Buzzwole. These two are pretty night and day in terms of quality, but they both do have a few very similar things. For starters, they're both bug and fighting types with strong offensive biases. In Buzzwole's case, it definitely plays as more of a physical tank, whereas Pheromosa prefers to be a glass cannon that has some pretty mixed offenses, and it's the fastest Ultra Beast by far. Let's start off by breaking down Pheromosa, because similar to Nihilego, I doubt the role very much changes in Scarlet and Violet. Pheromosa's already established itself as a pretty optimized Pokemon that typically just prefers to really go for that speed swap and then use options like high jump kick or ice beam in order to pressure opponents. I think the biggest benefit though would be from the new items that came out in Scarlet and Violet that do technically give it a bit more consistency. The Clearing Light, for example, would be great against potential Icy Wind threats like Flutter Mane and Iron Bundle, as well as just making sure that you're able to ensure Pheromosa's ability to just blow through teams with physical options. I think the biggest benefit though would essentially come from the Terra Ghost, which allows these Focus Sash sets to become far more potent, as you would be able to completely avoid the options like Fake Out that would otherwise easily break them. I still do think that Pheromosa would skew more towards the utility roles such as Speed Swap, or even just using itself as a nice pivot for teams with a nice fast mode next to Pokemon like Chien-Pao, but overall I do think Pheromosa would find some form of a niche in this format. Now Buzzwole on the other hand would definitely be a bit of a different case from these two, as I think it's a really strong candidate for Terastal. With defensive Terra options like Water, Grass, and Dragon, this would become an absolute monster in doubles. Thanks to its incredible stats towards the physical end, it could actually prove to be a very strong check to Pokemon like Chien-Pao, the Ogerpons, or really any physically offensive Pokemon with the right Terra in mind. Not only this, but you could definitely work around a pretty standard moveset of Drain Punch, Bulk Up, Protect, and really any fourth move that your team needed, such as Ice Punch or Iron Head, and it would see some serious success, at least as a pretty good option for your team's 5th or 6th spot. You'd probably see items like the Leftovers, Rocky Helmet, or even the Recovery Berries as really good item choices, and among the Ultra Beasts, I would personally argue this is a top 3 option for sure. I think it's hard to deny how Terra would definitely impact Buzzwole as a mainstay in VGC, because frankly, I think the worst issue with Buzzwole, and the only thing holding it back, was that the typing on such a bulky Pokemon was pretty horrendous, but Terra fixes that completely here. If this was singles, our next Pokemon being Xurkitree would have a pretty good case to be made, at least as a decent option. But in VGC, I would argue pretty confidently that UB03 is one of the worst options. Not really much to say here, considering the fact that unless it gets Tail Glow back, it's a pretty lackluster offensive piece despite its really high special attack, and most teams would probably just prefer to go with Boost Energy Raging Bolt, which is a nice slower option with priority and a much better offensive and defensive typing. Just like with UB2, UB4 is going to be split into 2 different but very powerful options, being Celesteela and Cortana. I would argue that Cortana might be the best Ultra Beast, though I do think there is going to be one other option that could compete with it, and it would be a pretty nightmarish wall breaker that most teams would really struggle to handle. With a Grass and Steel dual stab, while I wouldn't say this is exactly the most potent option in VGC, it does check a lot of very common Pokemon such as Flutter Mane, the Urshifus, and Chien-Pao. And with a Choice Scarf, this is actually one of the best Scarfers of all time in my opinion, making it into a very good cleaner for most opponents. Terra Ghost would allow Scarf Cortana to avoid any sort of fake out pressure from Pokemon like Incineroar and Rillaboom. Meanwhile, Terra Rock would unironically be a really powerful option, as it would check most Pokemon that would wall out this Dual Stab. Considering the fact that Terra Rock, Terra Blast alone would check Pokemon like Incineroar and the Thundurus forms, which would be two of the better means of switching into this Grass and Steel Dual Stab, this is already a pretty good case to be made for it, and you could still just throw on an option like Sacred Sword to hit Incineroar before going for your Terra, as that Terra Rock would more so be a matchup fix more than anything. Now Celesteela on the other hand is going to be a pretty strong option, but I don't think it's going to compare to Kartana. When we see Celesteela, it's typically going to be these Leech Seed stall sets, or sets built around Power Herb with Meteor Beam in order to enable it as a really good offensive special threat. While I don't think that much changes with Celesteela this time around, it does provide, in tandem with Nihilego, two very terrifying Flutter Mane checks that don't even need Terra to utilize their ability to defensively handle it. You'd probably see Terra Dragon as its primary Terra typing due to the fact that a lot of the new offensive Pokemon, such as the Ogerpons, would apply a lot of pressure to it otherwise, and a lot of the Steel types that do go for Terra Dragon typically have some form of potency, such as the niche period that Heatran had it, and most Goldengo that were ran in Series E and F. While I do think that any other defensive Terra typing would also have some form of relevance, I think Dragon would ultimately be the best, and it would help a lot with Celesteela just defensively speaking. Now while Guzzlord would definitely still be our weakest Ultra Beast for sure among the fully evolved ones, I do think at least that Terra could help it a little bit. But ultimately, I still don't think that Terra exactly makes this the not worst Ultra Beast. Best benefit that Guzzlord would get, I guess, is the fact that it could potentially become a really good sponge to Torkoal, though I think there's a better option in the format for that. While we've seen a lot of the other Terra hogging dragons such as Como and Dragonite really shine this generation, Guzzlord is far from the same level of potent as these options are, and I think it would ultimately prove to be pretty irrelevant in Gen 9, though I won't act like it's someone wouldn't have won a regional with this Pokemon at some point if it was here. Now we have our 3 Ultra Sun and Moon Ultra Beasts, and I think these are some of the more interesting ones. Among these 3, I feel like these are the hardest options to predict where they would land in terms of viability, and no, I'm not really talking about Poipole here because let's face it, Poipole would be objectively bad, and I think even among a Little Cup VGC format, this would be pretty terrible. But for now though, let's talk about Poipole's evolved form, Naganadel. For one, I think Naganadel actually could be a pretty decent option because the Poison and Drag Dual Stab offers a lot offensively here. Considering the fact that this is one of the few dragons that doesn't even need its Terra to pressure fairies very easily, this already would have a pretty incredible niche in VGC. Not only this, but for different steel types that would otherwise wall you out, Naganadel has a natural covered option in Flamethrower. So it's actually a pretty unique case because a lot of the other Ultra Beasts typically were one offensive move away from being perfect. I will say though, I think there's a couple big reasons why Naganadel wouldn't end up shining in Scarlet and Violet VGC, starting with the fact that Flutter Mane existing means that you really do need a poison type that will actually resist Flutter Mane. Even if you were to go for a defensive Terra such as Fire, Poison, or Steel, I think Nihilego would ultimately just be better at this job than it. You could definitely use this as a good choice scarf option, as really only Booster, Iron Bundle, and Flutter Mane would outpace you among the really viable Pokemon, and you could revenge a lot of different options in this format just by having that Scarf Dragon type stab. I don't really think that Naganadel is going to get the most usage, but I think it would definitely still be viable, and certain teams that would end up going for options like Regidrago might instead opt for these choice scarf special attack booster sets on Naganadel. Finally, we have our duo of Blacephalon and Stakataka, and I would argue that both of these would be two of the bonds that would be the most greatly impacted by the new mechanic. Starting off with Blacephalon, I think the Terra actually makes this from one of the worst Ultra Beasts to arguably one of the best, and I think there's a really good option to take over and reverse sweep a lot of players with the potential for Blacephalon with Terra. Considering your speed stat creeps Landorus and Shu pretty well, as well as the fact that with Terra fighting, you could take advantage of most Pokemon that would have otherwise resisted your dual stab, I do think Blacephalon would objectively be a pretty strong wall breaker for a lot of these unprepared opponents. While I do think that Blacephalon has objectively been power crept in VGC, it would be pretty hard to deny that this Pokemon with Terra would objectively be a menace here. As for Stakataka though, I would argue this is the only Pokemon that actually gets close to touching Kartana for any sort of relevancy. Terra is a pretty big game changer for Stakataka, as it gets rid of your really horrible defensive typing and your 4 times weakness to ground in fighting. You could honestly Terra into nearly any type and have a far more potent Pokemon in your hands. The premier set for sure would be Trick Room, Iron Defense, Body Press, and Gyro Ball, turning Stakataka into an incredible Beast Boost win con that would provide most of the format with a really difficult Pokemon to overcome. Stakataka would definitely be a really good option to undercut Torkoal's low speed as well in Trick Room, meaning that even if you were to utilize a set with Clear Amulet and Rock Slide, you could get a lot of merit out of just a Terra Rock Stakataka to revenge this matchup for you. I think there's a lot going for Stakataka in Scarlet and Violet, and I think it's one of those situations where it happens to be pretty perfect for the metagame, and I think if Kartana didn't end up being our #1 Ultra Beast, I very well think this brick with eyes that used to be considered pretty irrelevant would have a place to shine. If you're looking to see how good the Ultra Beasts would be in comparison to each other, I ended up actually making a tier list with my thoughts here, as I think these cover my opinions on the grand scheme of the format. Terra honestly does fix a lot of these Pokemon, and even despite the fact that options like Xurkitree and Guzzlord do rank pretty low here, I would be genuinely surprised if any of these Ultra Beasts didn't end up winning at least a regional level or higher event if they were in Scarlet and Violet. Let me know what you guys think of the Ultra Beasts in VGC though. Do you think any of them I got wrong, or what do you think would end up being relevant in general in Scarlet and Violet VGC? Let me know down below, and while you're on your way down there, make sure to consider subscribing as I upload different content every week regarding the VGC format, whether it's these hypothetical videos for certain Pokemon getting introduced, or ways that we can improve other Pokemon in VGC. Also, make sure to check out our editors, starting off with Kurt, who ends up doing an incredible job on all the content on this channel and is going to be getting back into Draft League soon, so if you want to check out any sort of singles Draft League content, Kurt's one of the best creators that I know. Also, make sure to check out Becca, and while I can't put her Twitch in the annotation on screen, just like with Kurt, her links will be down below. She does a ton of Twitch content, and I highly recommend you guys checking her out as well. Also, if you want to support our editors even further, consider becoming a member, as the money from the memberships goes 100% towards them, and you guys get some nice bonus content on the side as well. With that said, I'll see you guys in next week's video. Until then, peace out, guys.